Welcome to the Meteorology Matters podcast. We are going to be taking a look today at some pretty substantial shifts happening within the U.S. scientific and medical communities, especially in these first few months after President Trump's inauguration.
Yeah.
And you've shared some interesting material with us
Yeah.
that really suggests that there's a lot of change happening, potentially even a reshaping of American research and healthcare.
Yeah.
So let's really unpack this and see what this means for you and the broader scientific and healthcare world.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable the speed and the scope of the changes that we're seeing. It's not just like isolated incidents. It really does seem to suggest a broader kind of reconsideration that's happening within these really important professions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So a lot of what we'll be talking about today comes from a survey of over 1,600 scientists, and the results are pretty fascinating.
Right.
And it seems like a substantial number of these scientists are seriously thinking about leaving the United States. So let's kind of understand the reasons for that, or where they might be thinking about going instead.
Yeah. When we kind of zoom out and think about the big picture, this potential departure of such a large part of our scientific talent pool, it naturally raises some pretty big questions about, the future strength of U.S. research and our standing on the global stage.
Absolutely. And it's not just about research scientists. There are also indications of a noticeable increase in U.S. medical professionals expressing interest in maybe moving to Canada. And Canadian medical licensing bodies and recruitment firms are observing this trend. So let's explore some of the potential motivations behind that as well.
Yeah, it seems like, all these factors are kind of converging. Like the scientists may be considering leaving, the medical professionals may be looking north. It really hints at like a connected set of concerns that we should pay attention to.
Yeah, okay. So let's start by looking at this survey of scientists and what they're considering.
Right.
And what it revealed was that more than 75% of U.S. scientists who responded are actually considering leaving the country.
That's a pretty
Huge number.
Yeah, a huge proportion.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say?
I think so. And the fact that Europe and Canada are being mentioned a lot as possible destinations, that probably isn't just by chance. It's probably because there are already a lot of research connections. I mean, there's a level of cultural familiarity, and maybe even like a sense that they share similar values when it comes to science.
Right. What's really striking to me is the impact on those who are really just getting started in their research careers. And the survey really points to a very high percentage of postgraduate researchers and PhD students thinking about leaving. And it was a very large majority in both of those groups. And I mean, that's a really significant potential loss for the future of science in the U.S.
You're absolutely right. That's a crucial point to highlight.
Yeah.
Early career researchers, they're often the ones who are bringing fresh ideas, new perspectives, and really driving future breakthroughs. So if they leave, it could have long-lasting effects on the whole system of scientific innovation in the U.S. And what's interesting is that the survey results directly link this thinking about leaving to the disruptions that have happened since President Trump's administration came in.
So it suggests that there's a feeling of instability, or like a sense of less opportunity here.
So based on what we know, what are the main factors driving this potential outward flow?
Well, a big factor seems to be the cuts to research funding. It seems like the current administration has really cut back on research budgets and even stopped some federally funded science programs as part of this broader cost-cutting effort. And when that happens, scientists at all levels, they're forced to reevaluate their career paths.
And we also learned about these pretty widespread dismissals of federal employees, including scientists, which were then followed by rehiring because of a court ruling. So that kind of back and forth must create a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely.
For the scientific community.
That's That's a lot of instability. And
Yeah.
when you add in the possibility of more job cuts.
Reports of stricter immigration enforcement and anxieties about academic freedom, it really does paint a picture of a research landscape that's under a lot of pressure and a lot of unpredictability.
Yeah.
And you can imagine how concerning that must be for international researchers in particular, who might already be feeling a little insecure about their position.
Right. And we have one specific example of a graduate student in plant genomics and agriculture who had their research funding and stipend totally cut off because of the halting of support for the U.S. Agency for International Development. And this really, really made them much more sure about their decision to pursue postdoc work overseas.
Yeah, it's almost like, that personal story brings those wider policy changes into focus.
Yeah.
Their field, which is the study of global food systems, it's now seen as less of a priority in the U.S.
Right. So they're actively looking at opportunities in Europe, Australia, Mexico. They're looking for places where their expertise is actually valued.
Right.
And where they'll be supported.
Yeah. And like we talked about, early career scientists are really feeling vulnerable.
They're particularly during this time, and
it's such a critical point in their professional development.
Right, exactly.
And these really fast shifts are disrupting all of their carefully made plans.
Yeah, they often have less secure funding and fewer professional connections, which makes them much more susceptible to the immediate effects of funding cuts and all these institutional changes. And we have this other example of the physician scientist at a big U.S. university who had their research grant terminated, and now they and their scientist spouse are looking for jobs in Canada. It just really highlights that even well-established researchers are feeling the effects of all of this.
Yeah, so it's kind of a disturbing picture of what's happening in the research world right now. And we also got information about a situation where a researcher in Europe got a request from 2 colleagues in the U.S. to actually withdraw a scientific paper.
Wow, that's pretty unusual.
That sounds very strange.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. The reason that they gave for wanting to withdraw the paper was fear. They were afraid of being deported or losing their jobs if their names appeared on a paper about evolution. And one of the co-authors had already lost their job because a government grant got canceled. They were legally in the U.S. But all of this uncertainty created by the current situation led to this really, really unusual action.
Yeah. And it's important to point out that as far as we know, research on evolution hasn't been specifically targeted by any policies. But this incident really does show that there's a lot of anxiety. And there's a potential for self-censorship within the scientific community.
It's not just about research areas that might be actually banned. It's more that this chilling effect seems to be spreading to fields that could be seen as maybe controversial or politically sensitive, and that can really stifle the free exchange of scientific ideas, which is so important for making progress. And then there's the fact that NOAA has reportedly terminated a really substantial amount of grant funding across a whole bunch of research areas. And that just really emphasizes how broad these financial impacts are.
Right. And it's having this ripple effect. Because there are reports of layoffs at health and science agencies. And universities are cutting back on the number of graduate student positions they're offering.
So it's disrupting the whole pipeline.
And so this is potentially disrupting the whole future pipeline of scientific talent.
It's really worrisome. The fact that this European researcher felt like it was just too dangerous for their American colleagues to even publish the paper, it really speaks volumes about the perceived threats to academic freedom and professional security. And the researcher who was supposed to edit the paper, they expressed, real heartbreak over this. They talked about how it's damaging the normal way that science is supposed to work.
And even the head of NOAA, while they acknowledged how important it is to have open inquiry in science, reportedly they themselves had claimed to experience censorship.
Yeah, it's really
it's a really complex situation.
Yeah, it's complex and it's kind of contradictory.
Yeah, and the paper that they were talking about, it was focusing on evolution in both living and non-living systems and how it relates to the search for life beyond Earth. And I mean, that just shows how fundamental this research is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how it could be affected by this climate of fear and uncertainty. And it seems like these concerns are being felt even beyond U.S. borders. There's a report that the French National Center for Scientific Research has advised its scientists who are traveling to the U.S. to be aware that their electronic devices might be scrutinized. And that things they say in critical conversations could be used against them.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant development.
You know, it suggests that international scientific organizations are starting to see the U.S. research environment as potentially risky. And that's why they're giving these specific warnings to their researchers.
And there was that incident where a French researcher was initially denied entry. And even though there's an official explanation, that probably contributed to this feeling of uneasiness.
Absolutely. And we're even hearing that scientists in other countries are hesitant to even travel through the U.S. You know, even just for layovers. That level of concern could really hinder international scientific collaboration.
Absolutely.
And we have this example of a molecular biology PhD student in Canada who no longer sees the U.S. as a viable option for their career because of the funding situation. You know, it's another example of this potential brain drain.
And there was this really stark comment
from an investigator at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And they talked about this fast, broad, unprecedented dismantling of parts of science.
It's a really powerful statement. And it really highlights the seriousness of the situation and the potential for a major loss of international expertise.
And then we have a researcher in Connecticut, and they pointed out that their specific field isn't under immediate threat, like some other fields are, such as the climate change research. But they still see what they call a dangerous trajectory. Because they're worried that the government might start deciding what's acceptable for scientists to research.
You know, that raises some really fundamental questions
Absolutely.
About the independence of scientific investigation.
So let's shift our focus now to the medical field. Where we're seeing this really notable increase in interest from U.S. doctors in potentially moving to Canada. And the numbers that we're seeing are quite surprising.
I mean, the Medical Council of Canada reported this dramatic increase. It was over 580% in U.S. medical graduates setting up accounts on their physician application portal. And this was just between October of last year and March of this year. Compared to the same period the year before. I mean, that's a massive jump in a really short amount of time.
And their support services have also seen a big increase in inquiries from the U.S.
It's about a third more in the past couple of months. So it really does suggest that it's not just people browsing. People are actively looking for information about how to make this move. And this is also backed up by reports from healthcare recruitment firms in Canada. You know, one firm in Nova Scotia said that almost every doctor they're talking to right now is from the U.S. And that includes both American citizens and Canadians who went to medical school in the U.S. and are now thinking about coming back.
So what are the main reasons that these medical professionals
it seems like
are giving for wanting to go north?
Concerns about the political climate and the changes in healthcare, especially related to women's health, are really big factors. You know, the information specifically talks about worries about access to abortion services and gender-affirming care in some U.S. states. So that seems to be driving a lot of this dissatisfaction.
So it sounds like it's not just about their professional lives, it's also about what they want for their families.
Exactly. You know, a lot of these doctors are saying they're worried about raising their families in what they see as a safer and more supportive society. So it seems like they're thinking about their overall quality of life, not just their medical careers.
And it sounds like many of them.
Yeah, a lot of them.
Are already taking concrete steps to move.
Yeah, they're not just exploring the idea. They're actively taking steps to relocate and to get their medical credentials recognized in Canada.
Right. And, that really shows their commitment to making this move.
Exactly. The fact that recruitment firms are seeing doctors who are already in the process of relocating it indicates a real seriousness about this. And Canadian provinces are also actively trying to take advantage of this increased interest. Provinces like Manitoba and British Columbia are specifically recruiting U.S. physicians, and they're highlighting these more streamlined processes for getting licensed.
Right, and British Columbia is even trying to speed up the recognition of credentials for U.S.-trained doctors who have certification from the American Board of Medical Specialties.
That seems to be a direct strategy to attract doctors who are thinking about leaving the U.S. They're trying to reduce the bureaucratic obstacles, and the British Columbia Minister of Health even said something about it being an unprecedented opportunity because of the uncertainty and chaos happening south of our border. So it really does show you how proactive some Canadian provinces are being. They're directly appealing to U.S. healthcare professionals who might be looking for a more stable and more politically aligned environment for their careers.
So as we've been talking about, the information you've shared really does point to a potentially really big shift happening in the U.S. scientific and medical communities, especially in these early months of this new administration. And it seems like this combination of things, like the cuts to research funding, the concerns about academic freedom, and this perceived unfavorable political climate,
is really motivating a lot of talented people to look for opportunities elsewhere.
That situation with the withdrawn research paper, even though it wasn't directly about funding, it really illustrates the anxieties and the uncertainties that are just permeating the research environment. I mean, the fact that scientists are feeling like they have to avoid certain research topics out of fear, it's a really troubling development for the advancement of knowledge. And then you have this increased interest from U.S. medical doctors in going to Canada.
And it really underscores this trend of skilled professionals looking for more stable places and maybe even more politically compatible environments. Not just for their careers, but for their families as well.
This whole situation raises some big questions for you, for all of us.
And for the future of science and medicine in the United States. What are the long-term consequences of this potential loss of expertise? How could it affect innovation? How could it affect healthcare? And how could it affect the United States standing in the global scientific community? These are really, really important things to think about as we move forward.
We really encourage you to look into these issues more deeply. You can find more conversations on related topics by following meteorologist Rob Jones on Instagram. Meteorologist on TikTok, TV meteorologist, and on YouTube, follow Rob Jones Hurricane, where you can also find the Meteorology Matters podcast playlist. This is a rapidly changing situation.
Absolutely.
And it really does warrant, your continued attention and some real critical thinking.
And one final thought for you to consider
is how these potential shifts might not just affect the U.S., but could actually reshape the scientific and medical landscapes in other countries, especially in those countries that are seen as offering more stable and supportive environments, both for research and for healthcare professionals.
That's really interesting to think about.
It's something to keep an eye on.
Absolutely.